This is a sketch of a young man who went by the name Lyle Stevik. His true identity, which he had been hiding at the time of his death, was a mystery that police believed impossible to solve. That was, until 20 years later, when amateur internet sleuths on Reddit finally cracked the case. September 17th, 2001. It was the first Monday following one of the most tragic events in recent memory. Stories of heroism, loss, and speculation from the 9/11 attack dominated every newspaper and TV screen across the country. While everyone watched the aftermath of this national tragedy, a mysterious case was quietly taking shape in the remote town of Amanda Park, Washington, at the Lake Quinault Inn. Business was slow. In fact, the maid only had one room to clean that morning. But the guest in room number 5 was once again not responding to her. She had already knocked at the door several times, but was always met with silence from the other side. Had the guest already left? Did he skip out on a payment? Either way, she needed to at least offer to clean the room, and so, when a few more knocks went unanswered, she took out her keys, opened the door, and apprehensively stepped inside. But what she found was a scene far worse than anything she had ever imagined. This video contains discussions of sensitive topics, including mental health struggles and the taking of one's own life. However, certain scenes will not be described due to their disturbing and triggering nature. Still, viewer discretion is strongly advised. In order to abide by YouTube's terms, certain words are rephrased or censored throughout this video. Thank you for understanding. If you or someone you know is struggling, it is more common than you think, and there are many resources out there to help. Visit findahelpline.com to find free, confidential support wherever you are in the world. The guest hadn't left, but he also would not be checking out. She found him underneath the coat rack. There were no signs of life. Quickly realizing what she discovered, the maid ran out of the door to call the manager. Within minutes, they placed the call that would bring police to room number 5. Responders reached the scene within minutes and began collecting evidence from the crime scene and statements from witnesses. Much of what we know about the early investigations came from Lane Humans, one of the original responding officers and the only official to have stayed involved in the case from its inception until its resolution. When Humans arrived on the scene, the man's body was already showing signs of rigor mortis and lividity. It was estimated that he died roughly 8 to 12 hours before the cleaner entered his room. The room itself was eerily untouched. Each piece of furniture remained clean. The television was off, but the lights had been left on seemingly overnight. The bedding was spotless, and there was no food waste in the trash. There were, however, some odd adjustments to the room. A bed cover was draped over the front window, possibly to block light from outside. The extra towels that the man had apparently requested the day before were found in the room. 3 were scattered on the wooden desk, and the other 3 were still neatly folded in a chair. On the nightstand sat 8 crisp $20 bills that looked freshly withdrawn from the bank. Beside it was a comment card that read, "For the room." They found an empty Pepsi cup and a previous day's copy of the Daily World newspaper. But all of this revealed almost nothing about how this man had spent his weekend in the room, other than, of course, the most telling piece of evidence: a crumpled piece of paper with one word written in all caps. Unlike the man's hastily scribbled writing on the motel registration form, this one appeared to be written with more thought. On the check-in form, Lyle Stevik was written under name and 1019 South Progress Avenue, Meridian, Idaho under address. However, no form of ID had been found in the room that could confirm that this was his real name and address. Lyle used a mix of cursive and block print when filling out the registration, but on the crumpled up piece of paper, the letters were bigger and with more precise lines. Investigators theorized that Lyall had written the word on the piece of paper to explain the scene to whoever would find him in his room, but perhaps he discarded it when he realized an explanation was not needed. When the address Lyall had written down as his was checked, Officer Humans found out that it actually belonged to the Best Western Rama Inn, located hundreds of miles away from Lake Quinault Inn. Hotel staff from the Rama Inn were interviewed, but no one could confirm whether Lyall had ever stayed there or if he had simply picked up the address at random. Given that his address was fake, it was immediately suspected that his name was as well. The deeper they looked, the clearer it became that Lyall had meticulously erased his trail. Even his belongings weren't helpful in identifying him. Lyall had checked in with virtually nothing except the clothes that he wore, an unopened toothbrush, and a tube of toothpaste. He wasn't even carrying extra pairs of clothes or a bag to hold his items together. Scattered on the table was $2.40 in loose change. Tucked in his pocket was $8 in bills and a pen, which he likely used to write his final message. There were no signs of struggle, no head injuries. The intent appeared tragically clear. While the scene explained Lyall's death, it revealed nothing about who he was, where he came from, or what led him to Amanda Park. With no leads to follow and all questions unanswered, the investigators turned their efforts towards knowing Lyle Stevik himself. To a casual observer, Lyall might have appeared just like anyone else. There was nothing about his appearance that would make him stand out. Yet, there were small details that showed his well-maintained, disciplined life. For instance, it was clear that Lyall took care of his appearance. His nails were clean and neatly trimmed. His teeth were in near-perfect condition, with signs of past dental care. His brown hair, bordering on black, was combed straight back and had likely been trimmed within the past month. Investigators didn't find any tattoos, piercings, birthmarks, tan lines, or other identifiers besides a few scrapes on his knuckles and an old appendectomy scar on his abdomen. Toxicology reports showed no signs of prior drug use, smoking, or medical conditions either. By all definitions, Lyall was a sober, regular guy. But if you looked beyond Lyall's well-maintained appearance, more concerning signs pointed to his deteriorating mental health. At the time of his death, Lyall only weighed somewhere between 130 and 140 pounds, which is considered underweight for a man who would have stood at 6'2". Humans initially thought that Lyall might have just liked wearing larger pants, but the markings in his belt suggested something different. There were signs of wear down to the last notch, indicating that Lyall had gradually used different notches to tighten his belt as he lost weight. His skin showed no sagging or stretching either, confirming that Lyall had gradually lost weight over time. Humans offered a potential explanation. It's possible he lost the weight due to depression. The pathologist found nothing medically wrong with him. While this evidence hinted at Lyall's state of mind, it didn't provide helpful clues to his true identity. Lyall did have one relatively rare genetic trait: attached earlobes. Instead of dangling freely, the bottom of his earlobes were connected directly to the side of his head. However, subtle details like these can be easily overlooked by most people, especially if one is unaware of the rarity of this trait. Just like his other belongings, Lyall's clothes were frustratingly unremarkable. He was wearing a gray Fruit of the Loom t-shirt and Levi's blue jeans. A pair of black Timberland boots was also found in his room. Lyall's wardrobe was too sparse for someone who stayed multiple days at the inn, if you could even call it a wardrobe at all. He only had one other piece of clothing with him, a blue plaid shirt that had been tossed onto a chair. All were found clean and in good condition. Could it be that he deliberately chose bland and generic clothes to conceal his real identity? In the end, there wasn't enough physical evidence to identify Lyall. But what about his interactions with other people when he was still alive? The motel manager described Lyall as polite but didn't want to talk too much. He seemed spaced out, but nothing that would immediately raise red flags. Their conversations were brief, cordial, and limited. His interactions with the motel clerk were more insightful. She described him as someone who gave off bad vibes, strong enough to make her feel nervous around him. Later on, she recalled Lyall having a slight Canadian accent, suggesting that he may have come from Canada and spent significant time there. He didn't use the phone to call anyone, and nobody called for him either. None of the responding police officers recognized him. These details only strengthened their theory that Lyall was not a local. While Lyall's appearance and behavior revealed very little, it was the timeline of his final days that offered the clearest view into his intentions. He arrived at the inn on Friday, September 14th at 4:30 p.m. No one could confirm whether he took the bus from Port Angeles or Aberdeen. Both buses arrived at the inn at the same time, and neither driver could recall Lyall on their trips. Humans couldn't find passengers from these trips to interview. It's worth noting that at this time, CCTVs were still not widely used by most businesses, more so in a remote place like Amanda Park. Therefore, there was no way to view Lyall's movements before he set foot inside the inn. At the reception, Lyall wrote his name and address and paid for one night. Although he couldn't provide a valid ID, he was still given a room because he looked okay. He was initially given the key to room number 8, but there was a problem. The room was beside a noisy trailer park. The noise must have been off-putting enough because 1 hour later, he returned to the reception area considerably more irritable than before. The staff then transferred him to room number 5. Curiously, when asked if he showered in his first room, Lyall lied and said no. On Saturday morning, September 15th, the cleaner knocked on Lyall's door to clean his room. She waited for a response, wondering if Lyall had already left since he only paid for one night. When she still didn't receive an answer, the cleaner let herself in. To her surprise, she found Lyall inside the room. He was still there, and in fact, he requested to extend his stay for a few more days. But for some reason, Lyall declined her offer to clean the room. And for yet another unknown reason, he asked for clean towels instead. The innkeeper delivered 6 fresh ones, wondering what he needed them for. Either way, the conversation ended without incident, and she left him to his privacy. Later that day, the manager saw Lyall pacing up and down the 2-lane road. Although there was a nearby grocery store, he seemed uninterested in making a purchase. The manager didn't pay much attention to it, assuming that he was just getting some exercise. That day, a few people noticed him spending time quietly on the porch outside his room. On Sunday, September 16th, Lyall purchased a copy of the Daily World local newspaper, which was later found in his room. Once again, he requested to extend his stay and declined the cleaning service. Then, on Monday, September 17th, his body was discovered in room number 5. Humans later reflected on how Lyall may have spent those final hours. He didn't take his life right away. He spent his last few days probably analyzing his situation. He probably read the paper to keep up on national events, such as the attacks, to confirm his decision to take his life. The investigators made the following conclusions based on the data they had gathered. 1. He was hiding his identity. Humans believed that Lyall discarded his personal items such as soiled clothes, IDs, bank cards, and any other identifiable belongings, possibly to conceal his true identity. 2. He came from a middle to upper income family. Humans later remarked, no signs he was involved in manual labor, no injuries, well-read, articulate, clean, took care of his appearance, etc. I'm not saying that people from lower incomes don't have those traits. That was my impression. And lastly, 3. He planned this for a long time. Lyall's actions, from leaving payment for his hotel stay to discarding his personal belongings, showed considerable forethought on his part. Humans believe that Lyall traveled far away from home to avoid burdening his family with his decision. He further elaborated, Lyall doesn't fit the norm of cases of this nature I have investigated. The majority of them taking their lives at home, in their car, somewhere they feel comfortable. Very few have put this much forethought into it. Lyall's case was not like other missing person cases. Instead of families and friends searching for their loved ones who had gone missing, this case involved identifying a person who had already been found. They had his face, his belongings, and his biometric identifiers, but they lacked his real name and any information about his family. Was anyone searching for him? Did he exist in any official records? Searches for the name Lyle Stevik yielded no matches. There was a Lyle Stevik with a C found in Oregon, but the man was still alive and well. Some Steviks without a C were found, but none were Lyall's. With all the usual resources exhausted, the search then shifted to looking for help from the community. Posters with Lyall's name and recreated sketches were distributed to local tribes and through the local newspaper in hopes of generating leads within the Washington area. Eventually, the search expanded outward when the Garys Harbor County Police sent files to law enforcement in California, Oregon, and Idaho. Information was also sent to the University of North Texas database. The investigators sent Lyall's fingerprints to the FBI twice. Still, no one came forward with new information. It's almost as if Lyle Stevik didn't exist. Eventually, all the leads had dried up, and the investigators had faced a dead end. Lyall was buried in the town cemetery. It seemed as though whoever the man really was would never be brought home to his family. That was until internet sleuths took the case into their own hands 2 decades later. At first, Lyall's case drew little attention. He was often referenced in discussions about other missing person cases, but was rarely the main topic himself. But as more and more people stumbled upon his story, curiosity and fascination began to grow around it. The deeper people looked into the case, the harder it became to step away. One of those internet detectives was Lindsay Soller, who was also known on Reddit as Urbex, and her involvement would be the driving force needed to move this case towards a successful conclusion. When asked about her motivation, the answer was simple. For her, it was an obsession. From a young age, Lindsay had been exposed to data analysis and genealogy, often helping her mother with her work as a professional genealogist by organizing and cataloging records. Later on, she channeled her passion for working with data into her online hobbies, sifting through digital breadcrumbs to help fellow sleuths crack missing person cases. At one point, she joined the subreddit dedicated to identifying the Grateful Doe, in the hopes of returning him to his family one day. The Grateful Doe was an unidentified young man killed in a car accident. He had been hitchhiking around the country, following the Grateful Dead on their 1995 tour. For 20 years, the only clues to his identity were the band t-shirt he wore and 2 ticket stubs from a recent concert. He was eventually identified in 2015 when a community of sleuths leveraged the power of social media platforms to bring him back home to his family 20 years after his death. If you're interested in hearing more about the Grateful Doe case, we will link the video that we made about it in the description below. As for Lindsay, by the time she joined the Grateful Doe investigation, they were already on the cusp of discovering his identity. All the right pieces were already in motion. Despite being late to the party, Lindsay learned an important lesson from this experience. Building a community and spreading awareness is an effective strategy in solving missing person cases. During one of her many online deep dives, she stumbled upon the Lyle Stevik case, and the story of a man who had somehow gone unidentified for almost 2 decades had stuck with her. "Something always brought me back to him," she later said in an interview with UK writer Kirk Pepe. "There were so many clues, but they all led nowhere." That's why in 2016, Lindsay decided to create the Lyle Stevik subreddit. Over time, new members began to appear, and the community started to become more active. Eventually, Lindsay made contact with Officer Humans, who was now Deputy Coroner. He was happy to help in any way he could, starting with answering some of the long-standing questions from the case and clarified many of the details that we have already discussed in this video. Collaborations between investigators and internet sleuths like this were rare, but it was pivotal to getting Reddit's search for the truth started on the right foot. But when you're working on a case as vague as Lyall's, each small detail raises more questions than it answers, and almost immediately, this sparked theories to begin forming on the subreddit. One of the most discussed theories was the possible connection between Lyall's death and the 9/11 attacks. Lyall's death came only a week after the tragedy, and for some, the timing was too suspicious to be seen as a mere coincidence, especially when they considered his last known actions: purchasing a newspaper, pacing up and down the highway, and declining room services. It seemed to them like he was waiting for something: a call, an update, or possibly a confirmation. Baltazaro, a community mod, suggested that the newspaper might have been the last thing Lyall ever read. Something in the headlines might have triggered a deeply emotional reaction, news devastating enough that it prompted Lyall to take his life. Perhaps the death of a loved one. He might have lost someone close to him in the attacks, and the overwhelming grief pushed him over the edge. But not everyone agreed. Others argued that Lyall died before the official list of victims was even released. Without contacting his loved ones directly, there was simply no way for him to confirm casualties. Some theories were more sinister, such as suggesting that Lyall was involved in the 9/11 attack itself. Humans and his team also explored the possibility of Lyall's connection to the attacks. He sent reports to the FBI, but never received a reply. However, these details, or the lack thereof, didn't deter these discussions among the Redditors. Theorists pointed to his Canadian accent and what appeared to be a Middle Eastern heritage, suggesting that these factors, in their opinion, made him a great candidate for such a role. Theories about Lyall's religious backgrounds were also discussed. What if he was a victim of a religious cult? Some suggested that he had been shunned by a strict religious group, where members live every aspect of their lives centered around the church. A few proposed that he might have been connected to the Church of the Harvest in Idaho, since the false address he listed on the motel check-in form was located 5 minutes away from said church. Conspiracies also linked Lyall to the Amish, the Children of God cult, or even the FLDS. In every scenario, the common theme was that Lyall had been cut off from his support network, and that would help explain why no family or friends ever came forward for Lyall. Members also explored the possibility that Lyall was somehow connected to law enforcement, either as someone fleeing criminal involvement or as someone under witness protection. He could have been hiding from the police because he was unintentionally involved in something illegal, like a hit and run, or unknowingly taking part in gang activities. Perhaps he had been a participant in a witness protection program who was dropped off for some reason, leaving him vulnerable and with nowhere else to turn. What if he was hiding his identity to protect his loved ones? Some theorists suggested that Lyall's participation in the witness protection program may explain why he used an alias, traveled to a remote location, and discarded all his belongings. Although theories often clashed, the community remained united by a shared curiosity and deep empathy for someone whose life ended in silence. They had this sense of duty that Lyall must be reunited with his family, no matter what. And sometimes, sharing simple things that reminded them of their goal was enough to keep their quest for the truth going. One member visited Lyall's unmarked grave at Fern Hill Cemetery in Aberdeen. There was no tombstone or any other marking to indicate that his grave was even there. Even in death, Lyall stayed as an unassuming presence. The Redditor later commented, "We spent a few minutes there and I told Lyall how many people care about him and are thinking of him, just in case." While there, the member also found out that, interestingly, Lyall's body had been exhumed for DNA a couple of years prior. Eventually, what began as scattered online discussions gradually evolved into something more focused and powerful. Online conversations turned into organized actions. Plans evolved into small yet well-thought-out projects. Meetings were scheduled to talk about new theories or case details. They even made a verb to denote any work they were doing related to the case, Lyalling. And eventually, their persistent Lyalling began to pay off in powerful ways. More eyes were drawn to Lyall's story as they posted updates and case files to other Reddit communities, such as Our Unsolved Mysteries and Our Missing Persons and other social media platforms. Popular media agencies also began covering the story. Lindsay was invited for interviews on websites, podcasts, and even radio stations. All of a sudden, Lyall's story was no longer confined to a niche community. Working with law enforcement, Redditors leveraged the Freedom of Information Act to acquire relevant information, including autopsy reports, case files, and publicly accessible records. The community also collaborated with relevant third-party organizations to gather data and expert opinions. And with all these new tips pouring in, police decided to reactivate the case. Deputy Sergeant Brad Johansson, the new detective assigned to the case, maintained regular communication with members of the community throughout the investigations. Lindsay shared with Johansson theories, questions, comments, and missing persons that had been ruled out by the community, while he gave them any update he was permitted to share. Lindsay then organized a GoFundMe to commission a regression photo that depicted what Lyall might have looked like between the ages of 12 and 15, around his junior high years. The hope was that someone who knew him as a teenager might recognize his younger face. Eventually, they reached their goal, and the commission moved forward. When the artist finished, everyone was amazed to see Lyall's first photo alive, even if it was just an imagined version of his younger self. The photo was used on databases, websites, and social media posters. One user said the image looked exactly like how they'd always pictured teenage Lyall. In some strange way, the community felt like they had come to know him, and this strengthened their resolve to find answers. The Redditors were also involved when law enforcement approved of isotope testing for Lyall. Isotope testing in forensic investigations analyzes the ratio of different elements present in someone's hair, molars, and other organic samples. It could reveal someone's habits and the environments Lyall was exposed to. In Lyall's case, the test uncovered clues about his life before arriving in Amanda Park. 1. He had been traveling actively before his death. 2. He spent his childhood in various parts of the US, but not in Amanda Park or the greater Pacific Northwest region. These findings didn't lead to a specific identity, but they helped rule out several theories. In addition, these findings eliminated hundreds of missing person cases from the list. And now by this point, the community had ruled out a staggering total of 800 missing cases. But just like many other investigations, the journey wasn't entirely smooth sailing. The community found itself dealing with internet trolls who wasted people's time by providing vague or outright incorrect information. And not only that, but they had to revisit previously ruled out missing person cases time and time again if they happened to miss a critical detail or new information emerged. And getting documents from law enforcement itself wasn't easy. Requests could take weeks, if not months, to be processed, or even just to get a response. Some requests were also turned down due to legislative limitations. Progress was painstakingly slow because of all the waiting involved. Despite all these challenges, the community persevered, with each member having their own reasons for feeling so strongly about Lyall's case. Most members felt a personal connection to Lyall because they had experienced similar dark moments in their own lives and struggles with mental health. They survived, however, and working on this case seemed to be their way to reflect and process their own trauma. In fact, some had happened to find his story while walking a similar path to Lyall's and staring at the same potentially final crossroads just as he once did. But instead of choosing the same end, they found a new purpose in bringing Lyall home, offering kindness to a stranger who might not have received enough when he was alive. One person felt very close to the case because someone close to them attempted to take their own life. Also, due to certain aspects of the case, the amateur investigators seemed to experience a strange sense of closeness with Lyall. One Redditor explained this complex and nuanced phenomenon. "I think why people are so invested in Lyall is because his final moments, his lowest and most vulnerable moments, are there for us to see. You're forced to see sad things you usually only hear about. I find it a comforting thought that so many people like you and me and everyone here can feel this unity regarding Lyall. It's a light and positive product of a very dark event." And throughout the years of painstakingly slow work and constant obstacles to overcome, the Redditor who had started it all, Lindsay Urbeck-Soller, was there to lead the community through the darkness. Keep your chins up. We'll find him. Someone, somewhere, misses him, loves him, wonders when he'll call. There has to be someone. It can't just be us. As the search for Lyall's identity continued, certain leads began to take the community down unexpected paths, the first of which being the name that he had left them. Stevik has Slavic and Serbian origins, but when families immigrated to the US, the spelling was changed to Stevik with a C. In 2010, there were only 479 people with the last name Stevik in the US. Unless you're part of the family or personally know someone who is, you've probably never encountered this surname before. With that in mind, did Lyall get the name from a fictional story? The closest match they could find for the alias was a fictional character named Lyle Stevik with a C from Joyce Carol Oates' 1987 novel, You Must Remember This. The book character, let's call him Book Lyall, is a furniture store owner who constantly drowns in his own misery. He ultimately hits rock bottom when he's falsely accused of being a communist sympathizer. Despite struggling with thoughts of taking his own life, Book Lyall never attempts to do so. Instead, later in the story, he finds a renewed sense of purpose through his obsession over building a backyard bomb shelter. It was speculated that the real Lyall might have read the book before and adopted the name because he felt a connection with the character. However, while Book Lyall devoted himself to a new purpose, real Lyall pushed forward with his plans toward death. Redditors tried to find any other information that could connect the novel to Lyall, but came up empty-handed. Oates herself, however, did comment on the topic. "Very strange. Lyle Stevik is a strange appropriation." What was going through his mind as he wrote down each letter in the motel registration slip? It may have meant something. It may have meant nothing. Then a promising lead arose when one Redditor found a picture of traveling performers on Facebook. One of them had an uncanny resemblance to Lyall. They called him the Striped Shirt Guy. Striped Shirt Guy was believed to be a member of a traveling troupe of performers called Circus Chimera. The man in the photo resembled Lyall if he had styled his hair longer. They had very similar facial bone structure and the same rare ear shape. The lifestyle of a traveling performer also matched the isotope testing results, which indicated that Lyall had traveled extensively preceding his death. That said, there were glaring inconsistencies that were hard to ignore. Striped Shirt Guy has tanned skin and a noticeably different build. His nose also appeared sharper than Lyall's, and Circus Chimera itself was a group known for employing performers from Mexico and other Latin American countries, not the US. To clear things up once and for all, Lindsay got in contact with a former circus worker who confirmed that Striped Shirt Guy was alive and well. Although this lead went nowhere, the community gained a new ally from it. The former circus worker helped in circulating Lyall's information on social media. Next, a mysterious user called DAV Throwaway, or D, came forward with a controversial yet plausible lead. They claimed to be Lyall's brother-in-law. According to D, Lyall was 28 years old, struggling with mental health issues, and had family connections across South Africa, the UK, and the US. The most jaw-dropping twist? According to D, Lyall's family had known about his death the entire time, but they stayed silent because one relative refused to let them come forward. This detail immediately sparked theories about life insurance fraud. D's claims were both detailed and vague, seeming to provide lots of information while carefully avoiding revealing anything helpful. This inconsistency immediately split the community into two camps. Supporters of the theory pointed to how emotionally genuine the posts felt. Skeptics, however, noted red flags. Why post on Reddit instead of contacting the police? Why refuse to provide proof to moderators? Why was D suddenly coming forward with this info now? Revealing himself right as Lyall's case started to gain momentum was suspicious in itself. After over a year of theories and leads consistently leading to dead ends, the community knew that traditional investigation methods had reached their limit, and it was time to try something different. By this point, the idea of crowdfunding a DNA genealogy test had been brought up several times before as a means to hopefully find Lyall's relatives. The community had long been expressing their willingness to chip in for funding, since it could just be what the community needed to blow the case wide open. However, funding is not the only factor to consider when it comes to genetic analysis. Lindsay explained in a comment, "The problem with this isn't the funds. The problem is, are law enforcement or medical examiners ready to give DNA samples for sequencing?" And that's not the only barrier that the community had to overcome. Most commercial testing companies such as 23andMe and Ancestry.com only accept saliva samples since they are more cost-effective and reliable than hair or blood samples. But this option was simply not possible with Lyall. So even if the community successfully crowdfunded for DNA testing, two obstacles remained. One, obtaining law enforcement approval for accessing Lyall's DNA samples, and two, locating a laboratory capable of processing such samples. At this point, the group had spent over a year on the case. They'd made real progress, but not enough, and the lack of new information was bringing everything to a standstill. Determined to keep the momentum forward, Lindsay took a leap of faith. In 2017, she made contact with Colleen Fitzpatrick, a forensic genealogist and co-founder of the DNA Doe Project, a nonprofit organization known for solving missing person cases through investigative genetic genealogy. Since its founding, the organization has solved decades-old cases, including Buckskin Girl, Bell in the Well, and the Joseph Newton Chandler III case. They utilize modern DNA technologies alongside databases such as DNA Justice, Family Tree DNA, and GED Match to connect missing persons with their relatives. The Doe Project represented exactly what Lyall's case desperately needed, a helping hand that could make genetic analysis possible. Now, the only obstacle left in the way was privacy laws that prevented access to DNA samples. Lindsay, on behalf of the community of R. Lyle Stevik, along with the help of Colleen from the Doe Project, worked tirelessly to get law enforcement on board and finally start the DNA profiling process. Their efforts eventually paid off when humans, who was now the county coroner, believed in them to get the job done right and personally got them the green light for the project to move forward. But there was yet another potential issue. What if Lyall's samples were too degraded? If Lyall's samples didn't pass the quality control, the next processes might not have the chance to start at all. But if it passed QC, they were good to go. And just like before, the community patiently waited. But this time, the anticipation was mixed with disbelief. After years of dead ends and roadblocks, members couldn't quite grasp the fact that it might actually be happening. They may finally be about to uncover the truth. One grateful member wrote, "This is an exceptionally good news. Thank you so much for never losing your focus and dedication." To which Colleen replied, "It's because of the people like yourself who cared enough to reach out that Margaret and I decided he'd be a good case to use as our first GoFundMe person. We will let everyone know when the QC is done and what it says." A week later, on February 9th, 2018, it was announced that Lyall's DNA passed quality control and was deemed viable for analysis. With this development, the lab could now start with DNA sequencing. DNA sequencing is the process of reading the exact genetic code written in the DNA. It essentially converts biological information into digital data that scientists can analyze, interpret, and, most importantly, match with other people's DNA. Each person has a unique biological code. Relatives share similar genetic segments, while unrelated people would look entirely different. DNA sequencing must be performed thoroughly and meticulously to ensure accurate results. Even minor errors in reading the genetic code could lead to false positives or negatives. That's why DNA sequencing can take weeks to complete and require significant funding. Funding that the Redditors delivered out of their own pockets. The funding requirement was met on February 10th, only one day after the quality control announcement was made. In fact, the goal had been exceeded. Doe Project showed their gratitude in their update. "We wanted to express our heartfelt thanks to all for their supportive comments and pledges. We've exceeded our funding goal, as you all know." A couple of weeks later, on February 23rd, the first phase of the DNA sequencing officially began. Now came the most challenging part: waiting again. With a lengthy wait ahead, the community couldn't help but ask final questions before the answers that they had all been waiting for arrived. What theories were going to be proven wrong? What would Lyall's DNA reveal? Maybe he had famous relatives. Perhaps he was connected to another case. Or possibly his background would be entirely different from what anyone had imagined. One member put it perfectly. "Ironically, we may end up learning things about him that he never even knew." More than 3 weeks later, on March 12th, the lab successfully wrapped up DNA sequencing for Lyall's DNA without complications. Only one step remained: sending the results to the bioinformatics team who would build his family tree with GED match. This meant another week or two of waiting for the Lyle Stevik community. With the truth almost within their reach, excitement among the Redditors grew day by day. Members also appreciated DDP's frequent updates on the case. However, a lingering doubt filled every community discussion leading up to the breakthrough moment, and it all boiled down to one concern. When the Doe Project had Lyall's identity, would it be shared with the Reddit community? DP addressed these concerns in their update. "We'll share what we can, as we can." Despite their curiosity, most community members were understanding about potential privacy concerns. At the end of the day, everyone simply wanted Lyall's family to have closure. By April 23rd, DDP had started contacting people most closely matching Lyall's data. Most of the DNA matches clustered around New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, and Montana. It's worth noting that this didn't necessarily mean that Lyall lived there. There was a chance that Lyall's close family, specifically, may have migrated to a completely different location. Investigative genetic genealogy is both a time-consuming process and a multi-layered puzzle. Each match needs to be thoroughly analyzed to determine the recent common ancestor between Lyall and these genetic relatives. Hidden factors could appear at any moment and derail all progress. What if Lyall's family tree avoided DNA testing altogether? What if there's a hidden complication in the DNA that would only appear in the last moment? And if a very close match was found, what if they knew absolutely nothing about Lyall? Genetic genealogy is a complex and unpredictable process. Getting answers requires painstaking research and sometimes a bit of luck. To illustrate the point, DDP had to sift through the history of one man in Lyall's family tree who had 88 grandchildren. Each grandchild had to be checked and verified. DDP had spent a whole night verifying just one part of the family tree. Then, on May 9th, 2018, 3 months after the DNA Doe Project took on the case, Lindsay received an email from Detective Brad Johansson. She opened it, possibly half expecting a minor update, but it was not. It had finally happened. Lyall had been positively identified. The DNA Doe Project posted a press release titled, "Lyle Stevik identified after 16 and a half years. A close match led them to a man living in California, and from there, investigators followed the trail of breadcrumbs with renewed hope. This trail led them to a family who willingly provided fingerprints from old belongings of a son whom they had lost contact with years ago. It was a perfect match to Lyall's fingerprints. It was revealed that the parents never filed a missing persons report because it was always believed that even though he never wanted to associate with the family, he was still out there, somewhere, living the life he wanted without them. Lyall's family expressed gratitude to the community that kept their son's memory alive. They finally knew what had happened to their son after years of wondering if they would ever hear from him again, but they requested that none of the family's information be made public, and that included Lyall's real name. This decision might have been made to avoid a situation similar to what happened in the Buckskin Girl case. Her family received hateful messages online for not finding her sooner. This is just speculation. No one really knows their reasons. But regardless, after almost 2 decades, Lyle Stevik, who was 25 years old at the time of his death, was finally home in California, where he grew up. Longtime followers of the subreddit could hardly believe it was finally happening. Many shared their appreciation for Lindsay and the other mods' tireless efforts throughout the years. Without them to carry the community through to the end, Lyall's family may never have received closure. As to be expected, a part of the community was upset and disappointed about how this journey ended. I'd just like to see one picture of him alive. Maybe his family will open up more when the shock has settled and they realize that Lyall was a big, internationally known mystery that so many people cared about. The curiosity of knowing Lyall's identity was simply hard for some people to let go. And, unfortunately, a very small minority of the Redditors allowed their obsession to drive them to find ways of obtaining this information on their own, and even went as far as attempting to share it against Lyall and his family's wishes. We, on the other hand, out of respect for Lyall and his family, will continue to refer to him by the name that he left us. We also ask everyone watching this video to show the same courtesy, and please refrain from putting any information about him or his family in the comments. Thank you. What we can tell you is that Lyle Stevik was not a terrorist. He was not part of a cult, and that the Redditor who claimed to be his brother-in-law was a troll, heartlessly lying for attention. Lyle Stevik was simply a person, like any one of us. Although a few Redditors were disappointed, the vast majority were just grateful to see that Lyall was on his way home. After all, The subreddit's motivation for identifying him was not to know his name, it was to notify his family of his death so that they could have closure. This is and always has been about giving the people who knew and cared for this guy during his life answers. It isn't about our curiosity, and we're not personally entitled to those answers. I have a sister I haven't spoken to in 15 years. If it weren't for my brother being the most patient or forgiving human being on the planet and still keeping in touch with her, I would have no idea if she were dead. How crazy must it be to believe a family member to be alive and reclusive, to not only find out that he's been dead for nearly 17 years, but his case had such a huge following of strangers around the world trying to piece together his identity. Welcome home, Lyall. At this point, we feel that it is necessary to address the inevitable discussion of whether or not it was even right for the internet sleuths to try and solve this mystery in the first place. This is the only unidentified missing persons case that we have covered where the doe had taken their own life. Obviously, this changes things. It's probably fair to assume that Lyall made himself unidentifiable on purpose, in part so that his family would not be aware of his death and be given his remains. Therefore, by identifying Lyall and reuniting him with his family, it could be argued that the people who worked on this case were doing something that he himself wouldn't have wanted. But, of course, on the other hand, his family has expressed their gratitude for the closure that they have received. Also, if the police had been able to identify him on their own in the first place, they would have not hesitated. As you can probably tell, this is an extremely complex and nuanced moral dilemma that you are welcome to discuss in the comments if you want to, but we do not feel that it is our place to have any opinions on the matter. After Reddit's mission had been accomplished, Deputy Sergeant Brad Johansson served as the liaison between the community and Lyall's parents. Although overwhelmed, both parents had been appreciative of all the efforts the community made throughout the years to identify their son. Being the one to see the case through to the end, Lane Humans volunteered to accept letters from the community to be given to the family. The community had stayed dedicated to bringing Lyall home, and in the end, it was a meaningful and transformative journey for many members. Initially, plans were made to keep the subreddit active and give the spotlight to other missing person cases, just as the Grateful Doe community had done. However, the mods decided it wasn't appropriate, as the Lyle Stevik alias was now forever associated with the sub. Eventually, the mods decided to keep the subreddit active, but locked, and will now exist only to memorialize the events and discussions they have shared. If you're interested in helping unidentified victims claim their identity back and give their families closure, you can help by uploading your DNA data to GED Match, sharing missing person cases online, and supporting organizations like the DNA Doe Project. DDP is currently looking for donations to fund the identification of 9 does, including Metcalfe County Jane Doe. In January 2021, a logger working on a farm in Center, Kentucky located the skeletal remains of a Caucasian woman. She was wearing a short-sleeved t-shirt, a Hollister brand jacket, Almost Famous brand leggings with rhinestones, and a butterfly on the rear pocket. Coins, including tokens from a casino in Japan, along with sunglasses, a Bible, and a Pink Cancer Awareness NFL branded blanket were also found near the body. Authorities estimated her age at 44 to 86 and her height between 5'1" and 5'7". If you appreciate the stories that we tell, then consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. It's the best way to help us keep making more videos, like this one about the mysterious disappearance of the $30 million jackpot winner, and how the internet cracked the case by luring the suspect online. Click the video on your screen now to watch.